Great. So I'm going to talk about coastal human ecology, and I'll briefly explain what it is, and then I'll go into different topics on the subject. More than anything, this is sort of a theoretical, methodological, and topical review to really, it's almost targeted for students and young professionals, for them to kind of think of the kinds of things they can do. Given that anthropology has such a rich history in many different fields, and I feel sometimes that in the last decades, anthropology has somehow narrowed its vision, and I think it's important to reclaim that old way of doing anthropology and the kinds of fields we have worked, and we continue to work today. So I will go with coastal human ecology today. So coastal human ecology, basically, what is coastal human ecology, or CHE? It studies basically human adaptation biologically, cognitively, and culturally to marine ecosystems, and how humans transform socioeconomically, ecologically, and politically these spaces, and looks at sort of the reciprocal relationship between human action in the environment and the environment action on humanity, and both social structure, cultural aspects, and so forth. Now, obviously, this has been done by environmental anthropology for decades, but what I want to talk about here is sort of the specificity of coastal human ecology insofar as a study of humans and coastal environments. So it looks at the interactions of humans and the environment in all of their dimensions, and seeks to answer proximate or how questions and ultimate why questions. So the theoretical aspects. So CHE is not a theory. It's like, you can call it a field of study or a subject of interest, which is composed of many different theoretical contributions and methodological contributions. But it tends to scale down up. If you look at current socio-ecological systems research, they are at the global scale, they look at general patterns. So coastal human ecology, in the way I'm envisioning, is a much more anthropological and ethnographic endeavor, because it starts with the local. And of course, this is preaching to the choir. Anthropologists have been doing this for over a century. So let me just quickly sort of illustrate the differences in the conceptual framework between the coastal human ecology paradigm or topic that I'm speaking about, and socio-ecological systems theory, which is the dominant paradigm today in environmental sciences, and also in many people working with climate change, vulnerability, and so forth. Excuse me. So CHE tends to, coastal ecology, human coastal ecology tends to focus at the local, whereas socio-ecological systems theory is more regional and global scales. The field time tends to be different. I mean, my colleagues in socio-ecological research tend to spend short times in the field. We as anthropologists tend to spend long time. There was a day where anthropologists spend at least a year in any field season. This has changed a little bit, but that's the tradition. Obviously, some studies take a longer time to actually produce. I mean, in Solomons, I've worked for 33 years, and I'm still finding out stuff that I didn't know about, because things always change, of course. Units of analysis, we are looking at actor-based models and people, individuals and stakeholders, whereas socio-ecological systems tends to look more at systems. The theoretical scope, of course, I say neo-Darwinian here, but there are many different branches of coastal ecology. You can use political ecology, you can use different approaches to study this, whereas in systems ecology, you tend to look at systems resilience, vulnerability analysis. Methodology, of course, we do both observational and behavioral data, whereas in SES, mostly it's perceptual data, people's opinion regarding poverty, development, climate change, and so forth, right? And if you look at the ancestry of these approaches, you could think of Julian Stewart's cultural ecology as the ancestor of coastal human ecology, and you can think of the work of Rappaport and Moran and other ecologists, Margalef in Catalonia, for example, also in the case of ecosystems approach. Ramon Margalef being a Catalan ecologist of the 60s and so forth. So I'll go through some of the topics because some people may not be familiar with kind of topics. I'm assuming if all of you are part of this maritime anthropology unit, you'll be aware or you may have heard or read materials that are concerning some of the topics, but I want to go through some of the topics that are common in coastal human ecology, or at least which I envision and I've written about. So you have maritime interactions across space and time. And these, of course, include archaeology and coastal adaptation studies, indigenous navigation systems and trade networks, historical ecology of fisheries and seascapes, again, very important topic. Another subtopic we can talk about is ecological and economic behavior in maritime environments. So this is my own categorization of what I think coastal human ecology is composed of. Of course, this can be reshuffled and reinterpreted in different ways by different people. But I think that, studies of human behavioral ecology and evolutionary ecology on marine foragers, or the use of human behavioral ecology through foraging theory, is an interesting area of study and research, not something that's very commonly done anymore, except by some universities in the United States, but it's not a tradition that you see a lot in Europe. But again, it's one topic that's interesting. You can use also experimental economics in fisheries. Again, and I'll speak about each of these in more detail, but I want to go through them quickly so we can actually get to the particular subjects that we're talking about. Sociocultural behavior in marine environments, of course, includes ethnography of fishing communities, el trabajo que ha fet Pascal and Fernandez, Pascal and Modino and Silvia and other people, and in Catalonia, sort of the classical ethnographic research on fishing communities. Coastal marine tourism, also an important area of research. Again, probably Raquel and other people are doing this, and of course Silvia and other people in your team are probably doing so too. In La Costa Brava, again, the political ecology of fishing and aquaculture, a subject of interest in this field or subfield. Coastal food and livelihood security and sovereignty. That's something, of course, that Vicky is interested in, and other people again in Spain also interested in the topic. Other subheadings in this kind of classification of coastal human ecology, it's marine knowledge and governance, which includes topics like marine local indigenous knowledge systems, marine territorial systems and co-management, so looking at marine tenure, sea tenure systems, so stuff dealing with common property and common use of resources, or common pool resources, as Ostrom would say. Marine protected areas and socio-ecological impacts, again, areas of research where anthropology and coastal human ecology can have a fruitful impact in analysis. Marine interaction and complex systems analysis. This is more of the socio-ecological systems kind of research that I was talking about, but I'm including it here because there's a wide literature on the topic. So marine socio-ecological systems, looking at ecosystem-based management and other approaches of human interactive coupled social human systems. Environmental and climate change and coastal vulnerability, a topic of interest across the African continent and global. It's a global subject, of course, but there's a lot of interest here in the African continent. Proximate and distal drivers of resource use, again, an interesting topic, or economic change and how they affect fisheries and people on the ground. And of course, just quickly, this is a little sketch I've done to show sort of the proximity. Of course, I've talked a lot about different subjects and themes. And of course, they're all packaged within this coastal human ecology that I'm talking about. But obviously, if you look at the graphic here, the arrow length and thickness indicates this thematic centrality of the topic. So some topics are more typical of what a coastal human ecologist or an environmental anthropologist studying marine ecosystems, or maritime anthropologist doing work on coastal communities would do, and other things that are less common and probably more close to people in environmental science, human geography, and so forth. But I'm putting them all under the umbrella of coastal human ecology. Okay. So just quickly, I mean, I think that I don't really need to go through this because this was an introduction of my own fieldwork, but I think Sylvia mentioned this. I've worked throughout Oceania and the African continent. This is the countries I've worked in Oceania, a number of places in the Pacific Islands, but obviously I spend most of my time working in Solomons, but I've worked extensively in other places of the region. In Africa, I've worked in South Africa, of course, Madagascar, Tanzania, Seychelles, and so forth. I have a new project now coming in Liberia. So anyway, this is sort of give you an example of places I've done major field work. And I want to talk about each of these themes that I've mentioned, each of the topics I talked about in more detail, because I want to explain and talk how, not only their interest and relevance in terms of an anthropological inquiry to understand the human condition and human behavior, but also in terms of conservation, in terms of resource management. And these are issues that are important globally, and especially even without going that far. I mean, Las Islas Medas, and other marine parks and reserves we have in Spain or that we are designing. And often these things are done without proper anthropological research, globally speaking. So these are themes that I spoke about that can have a contribution to a deeper understanding of human environmental interactions at the local level. And obviously you can scale up to regional and national and so forth. But these topics are areas of research. And I mentioned before, archaeology and coastal research in the Solomons. I did a lot of research on that, on shell values and on the archaeology of exchange. And looking at coastal distribution of different tribal groups, headhunting and all of that. And you may ask yourself, why is that relevant? I mean, this is the classical historical anthropology and ethnography we do. But if you think about, we often think when we talk about resource management, we always say history matters, history matters. Well, you have to study historical processes to understand how it matters. So understanding the ethno-historical and oral tradition and historical context of any one location, and the means by which you get to that can be through written text, like archival research, archaeological research, and oral tradition research. So we did a lot of that. And obviously you will see in each of the slides, I put a paper of mine. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound too egocentric, but since I'm talking and I'm introducing my work to you, you have papers you can reference on some of the subjects I'm talking about to get a sort of deeper understanding, because I'm brushing through these topics. Also, indigenous navigational systems. Again, understanding interconnectivity between peoples in the Pacific is a very important classical anthropological work on the Kula Ring and other networks of exchange in where, of course, people are exchanging goods and services, but also, creating social reproduction through the exchanges of things or gifts. But understanding these networks, it's also very important to think about issues of conservation, because often peoples are interconnected by history and by culture and by language, and that has an effect in how people can access or use marine resources. So again, understanding these networks are important, especially in places like the Pacific, where living cultures are still very strong, particularly places like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and so forth. In my case, I looked at Tonga, different contexts, but I'm giving sort of the relevance of why this is important for coastal human ecology. In our case, we use some models from evolutionary ecology to look at chiefly lineages and exchange of different lineages through different islands and so forth. But let me get to other topics that are more important. The historical ecology of fisheries and seascapes, again, understanding the historical depth of resource use in any one place. In our case, we did work in the Marquesas with an archaeological team, and part of that was to understand the biotic history of the reef, use of the reef, and comparing some of the existing characteristics of the reef today with the zooarchaeological record, an archaeological record that we were finding on land, to see if what people were eating and exploiting in the past is still there today, and also looking at size distribution and other things related to the marine assemblages that existed in the region. We did work in Anaho Bay, in Nukuhiva, in the Marquesas, in French Polynesia. And also, my job was to do a reconstruction of the biotic history of the reef and human use of the reef. Again, you have references in the bottom if you want to read the papers that deal with this specifically. Other topics of interest, and now going to another subheading of that, illustration I gave you about coastal human ecology. You have behavioral and evolutionary ecology of marine forages. Excuse me. And this really is the use of optimal foraging theory to understand ecodynamics of human foraging or fishing in the sea. And this is very data intensive because you have to use things like understanding spatial mobility of fishermen. You can not only do this by by perceptual data, you have to have observational data. In other words, you have to do things like focal forays, meaning you follow fishermen and count fishers in general because it's men and women fishing, and you look at the caloric mean rate of return, and that is a different topic. But again, you have to do a lot of work following fishermen and measuring their catches, the time spent fishing, and so forth. You can use self-reporting diaries, creel surveys, again, and you can incorporate all this into a GIS or GIS, geographical information systems, to understand spatially and temporally dimensions of fishing. So, for example, this is a picture of the Roviana Lagoon of a particular area. You might not appreciate here, but they're little patches, and some of them, and this is mean time per foraging event, and this is mean return rate per foraging event. And you're looking at the location of fishermen across different tidal seasons, and basically a lot of where fishermen are fishing really corresponds with a profitable return rate. So basically the movement of fishermen or fishers in general is motivated by resource use maximization and so forth. But those are interesting ecological models that can be used to understand the sort of small scale dynamics of fishing behavior, of human fishing behavior, and actually incorporating those into a geographical information systems to have a bird's view of ecological and human phenomena at interplay. Again, there's a paper I wrote almost 30 years ago on the subject. In my case, I spent many years doing this. I have collected more than 14,000 hours of foraging data. After 30 years, I'm still analyzing some of that data. Anyways, lots of work in women and women in foraging, and this I will talk about a little bit further down. A lot of my work it's been applied. In other words, I've been doing work on designing marine protected areas, and the participation of women have always been important, but not only from a gender perspective, but also in terms of the resource use impact. So a lot of the work I've done on this is looking at shell gathering, mud clams, and blood cockles. And in this study, we basically set a marine protected area, one being a temporary, one a permanent closure, and then the open. And then we compared across various years, 2008, 2009, and 2010, the size distribution and abundance of the shells in the different sites, and basically found that both closed and temporal closures were effective at having a positive biological impact on the resource. And this is important because when you talk about food sovereignty and security, and you speak on the gendered aspect of this, you can establish a marine protected area, but be very disadvantageous to the activity of women. So in this case, obviously, we were trying to model and look at these dynamics to make sure that the marine protected areas were not having a negative impact on women. So what we found basically is that sort of the temporal closures were good enough and allowed women to forage, and also had a good biological impact on the resource. Other works I've done on the area also, and this goes back to all the subheadings I gave you about coastal human ecology, is the use of, excuse me for a second. Un segundo. Yeah. It's the use of experimental economics to understand cooperative behavior. So we used some tests that are used in experimental economics. I don't know if you're familiar with experimental economics. If not, I'll explain it later. In where there are these games that are played with people to understand cooperative behavior amongst different players and stakeholders in a community, for example. And these questions, or these games for us were related in terms of cooperative behavior, in terms of resource management. And we did find pro-social behavior, particularly, we use the public goods game. I don't know if you're aware of it. I can talk about it later if you want me to. But we found that basically older men that were much more open to sharing with other people. This was only men. There were no women participating in this experiment. Were much more pro-social and were actually basically cooperating more in the games that we were actually playing. In fact, this is important because if you're thinking of actually creating a marine protected area or a management plan, understanding cooperative behavior is important. And it's, understanding it from a typical anthropological point of view, where you just ask people, you interview with open-ended interviews and so forth. That's great, but it's not enough. And I guess some of that, you will notice a lot of the work I'm talking about is fairly quantitative and looking at behavioral aspects, not only conceptual or perceptual aspects. So we're looking not only at the emic, but we're also looking at the etic. So looking at the behavior of people rather than just, taking note of what they say, which is also important, of course. Again, if you're interested in a paper that deals with this, this is a paper in Global Environmental Change on the subject that I wrote years ago. You can actually look at it if you want. Other topics that are related to coastal human ecology that I think are very important is, again, ethnographies of fishing communities. Again, many of you have been involved in this. In this case, I also did understanding socioeconomic changes, coping strategies, and sort of those microeconomic issues that are going on, and seeing how these economic changes and really exposure to markets and so forth was having an impact on marine tenure systems or systems of indigenous governance over marine resources. So I did income expenditure analysis, time allocation studies, gender analysis, looking at differences between men and women in their foraging activities or economic activities, market activities, and so forth. Again, this was important to think when designing marine protected areas. Again, you want to make sure that a marine protected area doesn't have an effect on coping strategies and the well-being of the populations you're working with. So this kind of information is very important. And again, I think Silvia mentioned that marine protected areas is an important subject of study in Catalonia and in Spain. I know some of my colleagues have spent a lot of time working on that subject, but marine protected areas have to be designed with the proper knowledge, the proper information. And I think, obviously, one single researcher doing all of this would be difficult. You can, but you have to spend 30, 40 years doing it. But these are ideas for some of the students maybe watching this talk, or some of our colleagues, to stuff that maybe they can do in Spain or other parts of the world. Again, if you're interested, the paper is in Ambio. It actually talks about the methodology and so forth. Other topics, again, going back through what we were talking about, coastal marine tourism, again, a very relevant topic for the Catalonian, coastal littoral, el litoral català. Why? Because, of course, I mean, we have a huge tourist industry. Of course, this research here that I'm talking about is in an area that is not yet experimented tourism. So we used a GIS, a geographical information systems, to look at areas that were claimed by different people, and we georeference all that area to see if they overlapped with indigenous claims over those territories. And that gave us some knowledge about points of interest, that reef for people to go diving, or that fishing area for people to go fishing, or people to go bird watching. Where would places of conflict would be because of different villages or communities claiming those areas? And we georeference this across the region. You can see these maps here. You won't see, but each of these are, different georeference areas that were examined. And we found that in some places there were, serious things to consider before opening them for tourism. So this is the kind of work you would do before tourism. But of course, you can do it in mature mature tourist places like Las Baleares or Catalonia. Again, this is published in Society and Natural Resources if you're interested. Other areas, the political ecology of fishing and aquaculture. I'm not a political ecologist, but written a little bit about it, and you will see I've cooperated with some people in Barcelona, especially Ismael Bacaró, who's a colleague and friend of mine. In this case, we looked at I wrote about sort of these local systems that are nested and polycentric. So looking at the complexity of the marine governance and tenure over territorial space and sort of the different layers of complexity. And this is important, again, to understand conservation and resource management, because if you don't have a good understanding of local governance systems, and this is applicable not only to indigenous systems, is applicable to any coastal community anyway. Of course, the nature of the governance systems and the legal systems that overlap them are quite different in different circumstances. But again, interesting to look at different governance systems. Other work I've done is in coastal food security and livelihood security, food sovereignty. In this case, we did a study on marine protected areas and wanted to see if the marine protected areas were having a detrimental or not detrimental effect on nutrition. And basically, we did a nutritional and food security analysis through food diaries and medical anthropology. And basically, we found that the no-take marine protected areas were not having an adverse effect on local people, but rather the opposite. So we wanted to show if the marine protected areas were having a positive result in terms of nutrition and access to resources for local communities. Again, this is it's an old paper, but if you are interested, it's in coastal management. Other areas that I've worked on, again, I'm talking about my work, but I'm actually talking about the topic of coastal human ecology as I understand it. Of course, the contributions of many good researchers, and I'm sorry, I'm just focusing on my own particular work, but I also wanted to introduce you to some of the stuff I do. Again, marine ecological knowledge, I think Sylvia mentioned that has been one of my interests, but I've done a lot of pairing of indigenous local knowledge with marine science, not so much to ground truth it or to prove whether it's right or wrong, but to create hybrid systems between local knowledge and marine science. So we've done a lot of underwater visual censuses and mapping of the benthos using creel service, UVCs, interconnectivity studies, and pairing that with indigenous knowledge. Again, this is important for designing marine protected areas, using not only scientific knowledge, but using local knowledge. And this is not two things opposing, but they're talking to each other. And you can create hybrid systems of management that include these two types of knowledge. And we try to do this in various ways. You can see my students preparing the marine science equipment for the UBCs and mapping of the benthos and so forth. Again, we've written a number of papers on this. This is one on benthic mapping if you're interested. You can see a picture on participatory mapping for GIS, for georeference, all this information. So for example, here you see a map of the sea bottom of an area that was declared a marine protected area. But these are habitat categories of the existing habitat, but they're not only based on our own marine science knowledge, they're based on the indigenous mapping of what they consider the nature of the seascape. So seagrass, mixed coral gravel, coral reef. So local categories are close to the Western categories, but they're a little bit different. So the map shows the IMIC understanding of the bottom of the ocean, and we georeferenced that information and imported it as layers of information in the GIS. So this is a GIS map of indigenous knowledge of the marine, of the bottom of the ocean, basically of the lagoon. It's a shallow lagoon. And again, for the purposes of designing marine protected areas. And here are, for example, some of the other marine protected area maps of indigenous knowledge. And here's showing some of the complexity that goes into the GIS. Obviously, there are the georeference photos, of the abiotic substrate, locally marine identified, habitats, biological events of importance, like spawning aggregations, fishing sites. And each of these is a layer or a theme in the GIS. That actually we have georeference in a GIS database. I can ask the GIS to give us spatial information about many dimensions, which are both social and ecological, and also based on cultural knowledge of the sea space. Again, I've written quite a lot about this topic, but here's a paper that you, if you're interested, is in Human Organization that details some of this work. Other areas, so this is much more specific to the Roviana Lagoon. I spent more than 20 years mapping a lot of this, and basically each of the white spots you see here is a patch or an uniquely defined or indigenous defined habitat and fishing sites. And you saw all those themes that I was telling you in the GIS. So for each of these spots, which is more than 650 of them, we have all that georeferenced information regarding fishing, what people are taking out from there, local knowledge about what's there, what is the benthic characteristics, some of our marine science surveys to actually look at what we observe there, indigenous knowledge about cultural events related to that, spiritual events, and so forth. So a lot of the biocultural knowledge that, for example, Sylvia is quite interested in now, and which she's working with us here in South Africa to uncover, among other places. So a lot of work on cultural seascapes, again, related to indigenous knowledge. This is stuff on the actual, it's not only the GIS mapping, but also sort of a descriptive, typical ethnographic research on indigenous knowledge. And this I wrote with Ismael Bacaro, which many of you probably know from ICREA, a colleague of mine. He was at McGill University in Montreal before, and now he's in Spain. Worked on rapid ecological assessment. This is a paper that I wrote about 11 years ago that I'm really, for me, it's one of the papers I enjoyed the most writing, because we always talk about indigenous knowledge and its adaptability, and this is a topic that Vicky Garcia Reyes, Vicky would be very interested, and she has worked on extensively, looking at changes in indigenous knowledge. But in this case, we wanted to see what happened after a tsunami in terms of people's understanding of the seascape. The lucky thing was that I had collected both marine science data and indigenous knowledge data at a very fine scale of several areas that were affected by the tsunami. And these Buni, Kinamara, Saika are different villages, different communities, and this is the scientific survey. So while the percentage of different, so basically each of these points, the indigenous people told us what they were, through participatory mapping, and then we went and did a marine underwater visual survey to actually look at the functional groups and things in the bottom to see whether they corresponded with indigenous. And what the thing we saw, and this is important when we talk about adaptation, we talked about vulnerability, resilience. Knowledge is extremely important in understanding how resilient indigenous knowledge is. Knowledge is not static. So being able to measure change across space and time is very important. Obviously, this is quite simple. We looked at seagrass, coral, and other, important ecological groups. But the directionality, if you look at the scientific survey and all the villages, the directionality of change was perceived and understood by local people. Again, this is very important for people's adaptation to fishing, changing strategies. And again, we talk about climate change. It's a protracted and rapid, also in some cases, change in the ecological systems that people are exploiting, and be able to understand the dynamics of human knowledge systems and how they change with a changing environment is very important. If you're interested in this topic, this is in conservation biology. You can read it if you're interested. The thing here, we had the before data, during and after, right? Both scientific and indigenous. Other areas of research that are part of coastal human ecology, excuse me, again, is changing knowledge systems. Again, this is an area where Vicky will be quite interested. This is just a MDS of change. Yeah, thank you. And we were looking at in here, basically, this is the master list of fishing, so free listing exercises across different villages. And basically what the graph shows, these are the triangles here, the red triangles and the green squares, also broken by sex and age, reflect that basically the villages, the more the farthest from markets the villages are, and this is a work corresponding to that of Josh Sinner, a colleague of mine and someone you probably know, is that he talks about proximity to markets and its effect on indigenous knowledge systems. So here we did so by doing free listing exercises of fish and having them group them to look at how they were grouping fish. And we did this over a period of 20 years to see how knowledge changed. So basically, one of the findings was that the closer to markets are, and obviously the younger you are, the less knowledge you have, and the more knowledge you've lost. That particular paper is ecological indicators is a paper again. It took this 20 years worth of data here in this paper. If you're interested, here's the reference. And on a more global, in a more global framework, this is a paper I just probably not as specific to the coastal human ecology, but it's a paper on indigenous knowledge loss around the world. So getting back to some of the subtopics, and I will wrap up soon the talk. Areas of research that are important include marine territorial systems and co-management. Of course, we always talk about, the classical work of Exxon and other researchers that have worked in the coast of Maine and talked about territorial systems. Well, there's a lot of research on sea tenure systems and other types of turfs around the world. The Chilean case study with the work of Gelsik and others, also important. Anyway, this is research, of course, going back to the theme of marine conservation that you need to have when you design a marine protected areas. Perhaps in Catalonia, given the statutory differences between the law and customary use of the ocean and different territorial systems is probably quite different than Solomon Islands, but nevertheless also important to understand. So ethnohistorical research is important, going back to the first theme that I talked about, genealogical demography, mapping, also looking at interlinks and doing social network analysis and other analysis around people's connections in the region and seeing how that affects access to resources. Again, a lot of work on settlement, spatial patterns of settlement across the region, and this being georeference to look how population have moved over the last hundreds of years. Again, if you're interested on some of this work, I put some papers on the subject you can look at. So let me continue. Other work that I think is important and goes back to these kind of subjects, going back to institutional cognition and governance. And this, again, this is on the work I did more than 20 years ago, but I'm currently writing a paper with Raquel de la Cruz Modino and other people on the use of cultural consensus analysis to look at conflict in the use and access of marine resources, Canary Islands, Seychelles, Solomon, and other countries. So, so the reason I'm speaking about all these different things is to encourage the younger generation of anthropologists not to think that anthropology is limited to studies of gender, race, decolonization, and so forth. Our discipline is so wide, and there's so many different methodologies we can use that I think that, my purpose here is to encourage you to think about the different dimensions that you could actually study in your own research in the Costa Brava or elsewhere in Spain or Europe or anywhere in the world. So you can use cultural consensus analysis to look at cultural consensus and differences between cultural consensus, between age groups, stakeholder groups, and so forth. And this is important to understand conflicting natural resource access and use. Again, if you want to see specific findings, this is a paper I wrote long ago, but it was a cultural consensus analysis on different villages. And actually it was interesting because even though they shared the same cultural model, if you want to call it, when I did a cultural domain analysis, there were big differences between different villages. And the difference had to do with proximity to markets. So the more modernized you are, the more conflicts you have, basically, to make it into a snippet. Now, marine protected areas and social ecological impacts. Again, I've done quite a lot of work on the marine science of the biological aspects of marine protected areas as well as the social aspects. What are the social impacts? What are the biological impacts of marine tenure, of marine protected areas? Again, using underwater visual censuses, settlement tiles, and other marine science methods to actually quantify the size and abundance of different species in different areas. This particular research was on parrotfish. And again, we found that parrotfish were way more abundant in the marine protected areas than they were in the non-marine protected areas. again, and this can obviously be interconnected with social science research, because obviously you're working with local stakeholders who are working in the marine protected areas and using their knowledge. As you've seen, I've talked about the mapping of local knowledge and so forth. I'll be wrapping up soon. Work on environmental and climate change and coastal vulnerability. We've done similar things with the mapping exercise that I was showing you on habitats, but looking at change over time and looking at possible effects of climate change on mangrove density and distribution across the coastal areas, looking at water turbidity. And mind you that the top maps here are the actual maps made through participatory mapping with the local people, and these are actually scientific maps of the actual turbidity of the water using different methods, or our team using different methods, looking at water quality and also looking at mangrove distribution and abundance in the region. So we compare the maps, and there's a good correspondence with what people are saying and what we're finding scientifically. Again, this is the same study, the same with coral reefs. And they're, we're looking at 1986, and then looking back at 2011. This is a little bit dated, but again, looking at spatial and temporal changes in coral disease and bleaching, which local people cannot distinguish. But again, here, mixing science and social science again. This is the same. I'm not going to talk much. It's again, it's a paper we did on the similar topic in Madagascar. Coastal vulnerability, again, one of the subjects of coastal human ecology that I was talking about. We did a study on social and environmental recovery after a tsunami, and basically found that both social and environmental perceptions of recovery were not coupled. In fact, people saw environmental recovery to be much faster than social recovery, interestingly enough. Again, papers that are published on this, you can actually look here. Proximate and distal drivers of resource. Again, looking at market chains and how they affect the use and access to resources. We did a lot of work on pelagic fishing in the Solomons, found that over a span of 20 years, fishermen and fishers in general have moved their territory and are targeting different assemblages of species. So let me wrap up the talk. So I spoke about all these different topics that are actually under what we call coastal human ecology. Now, if you want them to put them together, just in a conceptual model or conceptual framework, how, what would you do? So this is an illustration, just a small exercise of building what we call a conceptual model. And this would be, for example, considering spatial closed areas and links with human systems, for example, right? So the different kinds of data that I was talking about in the different kinds of subheadings and studies that I was talking about across the talk, now, they are not all here, but you see the geospatial analysis, the ethnohistorical analysis, the institutional cognition, and their feedbacks between different components of the study and how they. So you can build these conceptual models to understand the interconnectivity of different data sets and how they apply for the design of a conceptual model, which actually helps you to design a marine protected area, which with many different kinds of data. And mind you that this is important because a lot of marine protected areas across the world are designed with actually absolutely very little data. And often we have a very high failure rate in marine protected areas in many parts of the world, precisely because a lot of the studies that are required to design them properly are not done before. Now, obviously, you're going to say, well, you've spent 20, 30 years studying this. We don't have 20, 30 years, but there are means of doing this much faster. The benefits of a conceptual model, of course, it's not a predictive tool yet, but it provides a framework to incorporate different forms of knowledge and integrate it into larger conceptual frameworks as socio-ecological systems and looking at coupled natural human systems. This can be upgraded into a qualitative model that has negative and positive impacts by including specific examples and feedback loops between different subsystems in the actual system. And it can be turned into a quantitative model of current ecosystem services losses, okay? So example, you would try to map a post-climate change scenario in ecosystem services of coral reefs. You could use this information to actually plug different data sets into the model in order to create a predictive model of a post-climate change reef damage scenario, both in food security, access, and other different parameters of human well-being. Again, this provides a window to integrate different forms of coastal human ecology information that I talked about into a sort of a conceptual model. So let me conclude here and just quickly, using a lot of this information in my work, we design, when I say we, I mean myself, my students, and co-workers, we have designed, we designed a network of marine protected areas in the Solomon Islands, constituting of 32 marine protected areas. Obviously, this was in the early 2000s. 20 years down the line, 80 to 90% of the marine protected areas have failed, which really begs the question, after giving me all the information I've given you about the kinds of data sets you actually need to design these protected areas and do it properly, you can still fail. And again, this is a different conversation of why, but there's still some of them working, but some of them have actually been abandoned by local people. So again, you know, this fine-grained information about the coastal human environmental interactions is key to the development of an integrated system of management, or designing integrated systems of management. And we always talk about human condition. We always talk about mixing the humanities and social sciences, but you have to be there has to be a way to do it. And I think a lot of the methodologies and topics that I was talking about are conducive to that kind of integration. So we can develop hybrid management systems that incorporate Western scientific knowledge and local indigenous knowledge into sort of hybrid management systems. And that can be, again, formulated through the use of research that I've talked about in this talk. I think, jo crec que amb això ja tinc prou. Aquí teniu dos papers que més o menys parlen de tot això. There are two papers that actually define and sort of summarize, summarize. They explain much more specifically the things I've talked about in this presentation. One is in biological conservation and the other one is in American anthropology. So if you want to read about coastal human ecology, these are the papers you could read. Well, the others, but these are the ones I've written. Moltes gràcies.